be a long one today, guys, so I'm just going to jump into it. We're continuing to examine Guillermo del Toro's work in preparation for his upcoming TV show, Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, that releases on October 25th. Today we're going to jump into another horror TV show he produced back in 2014 called The Strain. Guillermo del Toro originally pitched The Strain in the early 2000s as a TV show set in New York City that had some unconventional vampires Strigoi, but the flavor of vampires featured at that time was going to be the more romantic Twilight style vampire, so this gory horror take on the genre was just not in vogue. Instead, Guillermo del Toro partnered with Chuck Hogan to create 3 novels and several graphic novels based off of this idea. The Strain series got so much attention and interest that del Toro was able to come back in 2014 and produce The Strain as he originally intended it. He originally pitched the 3 books as a 4-season TV show. Later on in production, he realized it was taking too long to get through some of the story synopsis and tried to come back for a 5th season. There was a moment where the studio agreed to it and then they reneged. We're not really sure exactly why this back and forth happened, but many people suspect it's because of low ratings in the 3rd season. And to be honest, it doesn't really matter about the 4 seasons versus 5 seasons for The Strain. Overall, the 4th season does wrap up the entirety of the 3 books, and everything is tied in a neat bow at the end. If you're looking for a more detailed breakdown of each one of the seasons, I actually suggest Maven of the Eventide's review on The Strain Season 1 and Season 2. I will go ahead and link those up here and in the description down below. I really enjoy her channel. I think she does a great takedown of the vampires and breaking all the lore and information down. And these reviews of The Strain are fairly recent, so unlike the review she did of Blade, you're going to get to see her more modern production and pacing schedule. So I definitely think if you're curious about more information regarding The Strain or like a quick summary of it, you should check it out there before diving into this review. Del Toro and I just love all things gothic, so like all of his other works, we have to ask, is The Strain gothic? And based on this channel's requirements, we have 9 separate elements that could make something gothic. You only need 3 of the 9 to qualify. You can see a full list and breakdown of those elements in the video here. As it stands, The Strain hits 5 of these 9 points. First is going to be elements of loneliness and longing. Without getting into too many arcs or plot points, The Strain is a study of human isolation. F, the main character from the CDC and the doctor that we're following throughout all 4 seasons, starts off pretty lonely. He is going through a divorce situation between his wife and himself that he doesn't want to accept. And he's fighting for custody of his son. It doesn't look like he's going to win even partial custody at the end of the day. So even before the vampire plague hits, it looks like his life is pretty lonely and isolated. And it's something that we see just crumble even further as the series goes on. F's son Zach's entire point of conflict comes from the loss of his mother and him missing her and trying to recapture a whole unified family. Gus, Fett, and Dutch all have more complicated manifestations of loneliness and longing, but each character that we feature within The Strain in its own way is struggling with some kind of isolation, loneliness, and failure to connect and really communicate with others. Even the bad guys are in on it. Eldridge Palmer is the main human villain within The Strain. He's set up as a lone wolf, nobody is his peer kind of character, and we eventually get an arc where he does come to relate to some of humanity, and this is part of how he gets his redemption within the season. There's also some complicated interactions between the Strigoi master vampire and his son, as well as the Strigoi master vampire and F's son Zach. And all of this sort of indicates, even though the master claims that he doesn't want or need anyone and that he likes to be alone on his own, it's not entirely true, or it doesn't feel true, since she keeps trying to give his son chances to be at his side. He steals F's son and raises him as his own and cares for him in a way that confuses even some of his closest followers. It could be that he just wants Zach as a body snatch later in life, or he is just trying to torture F. But some of the things he does and the ways he interacts with Zach sort of suggest to me, at least in part, he's looking for some kind of relationship, whether permanent or temporary, with Zach, and he's trying to get some kind of sense of what it means to be a father and what it means to have someone love him like a mentor or father. Even Einhorst's whole Nazi arc and eventual turning into a vampire all gets kicked off when he's rejected by a girl. He is like the ultimate villain incel arc. And even Kelly's true danger doesn't come from her vampire nature or her easy ability to track down her son. It comes from a longing, desire, and even certain level of love for her son Zach that she carries even after death and after this transformation, and is really driving her. Next is going to be human mortality. Death is everywhere within the strain, like all kinds of sort of thriller, action TV shows. There's just a lot of disposable characters. But even when we look at the main cast, there are a ton of shakeups. But because we aren't dealing with just a common plague where the only thing we're fearing is catching it and dying, there's actually a fear of turning, which makes this middle death step become possibly a relief instead of the ultimate evil. The characters are forced not only to face their own mortality, but they're forced even sometimes to embrace their mortality and their death instead of the alternative. In this way, we see sometimes characters killing off other humans who have been infected before they have a chance to turn, and this is considered a mercy or a gift. They even call it releasing someone, and it forces them to reconsider the whole spectrum of life and death, because once they die and become a Strigoi, everything they know is going to be information the Master has and memories the Master has that he can then use against their loved ones. And when you think about those alternatives, being human, being dead, or being Strigoi, it makes a struggle to either be human or dead the goal. And I just think that this particular element is very gothy to sort of make death a friend or an ally. Next is going to be the supernatural element. Season 1 tries to play very coy about the science fantasy line going on in the strain. Ultimately, I think it executes poorly, and probably by the 4th or 5th episode, it abandons any kind of like science procedural elements and devolves into an entirely fantasy, slightly insane, almost jumping of the shark kind of story. And I think part of the issue for me when I originally watched this is I did think that it was going to be more scientifically grounded than it is. And if you go into this show thinking it's going to be entirely fantasy and lore-based, you're set up to have a better time of it. I was kind of curious to see how the novels executed on this premise, because I felt like it failed in a lot of ways in the TV show. And there are a ton more fantasy elements and explanations and lore that we don't get in the TV show that appear in the books, apparently. I think we would have been better entirely abandoning the procedural, rational, science-y kind of stuff and going 100% commitment to fantasy. But some of the fantasy we do get in the strain is very good. The whole Strigoi element has very strong rules, feels like very vampire-esque, classic, traditional, supernatural being that doesn't have any nature-based element that we can tie it back to. Generally, Del Toro does focus on the supernatural in really intriguing ways, and the supernatural element usually ties into the main theming and the plot of his stories and makes all of it stronger. The strain does this in some cases, and in other cases, I feel like the fantasy element actually took away from the story. It is hard in a 4-season show to maintain that kind of suspension of disbelief, adhere to the rules, and still be telling someone something interesting and new. But even with all of those caveats granted, the strain doesn't really do a great job as a TV show. And even though it has strong supernatural elements, I don't think they make things better all the time. Use of folklore and legend. The use of these elements in the strain was really something special. In fact, all of the flashback scenes, whether we're getting like Nazi lore history, Victorian era history, Greco-Roman history, all of those parts of the strain were the best parts. Seeing some more about how humans have historically dealt with the Strigoi and vampires in general, and just seeing what their place was in the world, how they kind of like wove their way in and out, what their relationships with people were. All that stuff was really good. It was shot really well. It was very engaging. I think it's by far the best part of the TV show. And lastly, there's also a strong sense of place in the strain. I think setting this in New York City works really well. One of the characters, Fed, uses his architectural knowledge and his historical background for these buildings to give us like secret passageways and little bits of knowledge and history and color that make the city come alive and make the setting feel more grounded and real. Also, I know Del Toro was originally inspired by like the Gothic tops of large city buildings, as well as the potentialness for creepy creatures to live in the subway. And I think the show utilizes both of these elements in New York City really well. Captures that like modern contrast with striving for some old, more grounded history that quite a few American cities go for, New York City included. And I also found the characterization of the people from New York City to be pretty accurate and interesting. Felt like they were telling me about characters I knew and who belonged in this place in this time. Some near miss on the Gothic points are going to be horror elements. The Strain's trying really hard to be a horror story, and it's just not managing. I want to be clear, there are definitely moments of discomfort and tension within the Strain, and there were moments where I was worried or afraid, especially in season 1. But if you're asking for someone to be scared or to find something a horror for 4 seasons, that's a big ask. I've always thought that shorter is better with horror stories because if someone gets used to something, they're no longer afraid of it. And I think the Strain in some ways is even further hampered because I found some of the designs to be like not scary and just generally goofy. And that certainly didn't help make me fearful or concerned. Also, I would say that I didn't really care enough about any of these characters to really be worried about them or really be upset about their potential deaths, which rolls me right into character as king. The Strain is definitely trying to give full character arcs to a large ensemble cast. They're definitely trying to study humanity and in specific these particular humans that we're following. And they do have a lot more character arc than you might expect in a typical show. One of the main flaws is how they handle these characters. Sometimes they do things that don't seem very character driven at all and seem entirely so the plot can keep going. And there were often times in my notes where I was like, why is this person doing this? Well, I guess it's because story's got a story, which is not very satisfying and is the antithesis of letting the characters lead the story. And last but not least is going to be the miss on the more poetic prose. The Strain has its moments. There are definitely scenes and visuals that are worth talking about. But when I look at it as a 4-season-long show, there's not enough diversity of what's going on screen. There is color filters going on over all of the footage, and I suppose the color filters are unified, but none of this stuff that I'm talking about is really helping to drive the story. The show is not something I would recommend for its visual spectacle. Hopping into my observations, just so you guys know, I've never read the novels or the graphic novels the Strain is based off of. From my experience with the TV show, I never want to read them. I think it's incredibly fitting that this show was originally produced by FX because they also made Breaking Bad, and my feelings about the Strain are pretty much on par with Breaking Bad. Shows that I did not enjoy watching, but for some reason could not stop. Even as I was like writing my notes, this is
horrible and I don't like this and there's so much about this that's bad and generic for X, Y, and Z reasons.
Particularly, I think seasons 2 and 3 were like way overly self-indulgent. And if you wanted to watch The Strain for some reason, or you thought it was an interesting concept, I think if you watch season 1 and season 4, that's your best bet. Season 1 has some interesting things going on. It's enough taste of the Strigoi and their slow takeover of New York City to be like scary. And then season 4 is doing something really new and fun and refreshing. And I actually really enjoyed season 4 all the way until the last 2 episodes. But I felt like what we got in the third to last episode hit all the things I wanted to see, and the way things wrapped up, I would have just rather been wondering than view the ending that we got. Another thing that's worth mentioning is when I watched The Strain, I originally did watch the first season as it came out in 2014 and decided the show was not for me and didn't come back for season 2. So watching season 2, 3, and 4, this was my first time watching it, and I binged all 4 of these seasons on a 3-day weekend. Some of my critiques and nitpicks are probably going to be specific to having watched all of these over 3 days instead of watching them once a week. Moving into the visuals, as I said, there are individual scenes and set pieces that stand out. There is a bathtub scene in season 1 that I think is like a beautiful reverse love note to Don't Be Afraid of the Dark's bathtub scene. The vampire heart in the jar is super creepy. The 9-foot coffin, some of the other detail set pieces like that were really interested. Eldridge's office, the sweeping subway sets, the symbolism that they use for the partnership later in season 4. There's a lot of little details like this that are very well executed and are interesting and definitely stand above what you would expect to see in a TV show. All of the period piece storytelling is amazing, but then we get to the Master and he is so fucking goofy looking. Like, from his debut on screen, I'm not scared of that guy. I burst out laughing the first time I saw him in 2014. He's just not creepy. And knowing that that guy is the guy who's pulling all the strings takes a lot of tension for me away from some of the other things that are happening that are like body horror and horrific, to these people changing from human to strigoi for the first time. I will say that original transformation and the loss of humanity over the plane victims that we get to view is really scary and creepy and incredibly tense. And there is like this great tension between whether or not the CDC is going to be able to contain them or figure out what's going on. I think still one of the most heartbreaking and striking moments of all the seasons is one of the survivors has a wife and kids, and as he's turning into a strigoi, he knows something is wrong, and he sends his wife and children away to their grandparents' home and eventually like chains himself up in the shed in an attempt not to hurt his wife and children. Like, that combination between him like wanting to eat them, wanting to kill them, and like fighting that and trying to keep his humanity as long as possible is incredibly heart-wrenching and effective. The timing of flashbacks and the reveal of backstory for some of our longer-lived characters is really effective. There were times where I was like a little bit impatient to know more, or like kind of chomping at the bit for more information, but holding it back is part of the tension. And I think like the desire to know more and then like the release of getting that information is really well executed. The show does have a large cast with multiple points of view and storylines going on, and it really benefits it because for large portions of the show, at least one or more of these characters' perspectives is a slog, just annoying, terrible to get through, or boring. So it's nice to have like a second perspective or a secondary story going on that you might still be invested in. Obviously, it's preferable when you like all the different points of view, or like when an ensemble cast actually comes together to be telling like a unified story, and I don't think that we get that from The Strain, but we've already kind of established that I don't think The Strain is doing the most it can or doing what it is doing very well. And even though we do have some diversity within the cast and within the characters themselves, it's a little bit disappointing that all the main characters seem to be white, straight men. Like, whether we're talking about F or Eldridge or the Master or Einhorn, these are all like the major players, and Abraham, and they're all just like old white guys. And to a certain extent, whether we're talking about the heroes or the villains, all of these men are holding up the same kind of power and perspective and are looking at problems and looking for solutions in the same ways. I also think the show has an inappropriate use of a child character, which to me is probably one of the most disappointing calls in the whole show. Because if anything, Pan's Labyrinth, Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, The Orphanage, Mama, all of these other works that Del Toro has children either as protagonists or as a main focal point, he shows he understands both how to portray characters and what child characters bring to those roles. Basically, these kids are usually actual children with foibles and like the kind of expected flaws or pluses that you would get from children. They can give the audience a sense of wonder and belief in magic that adults don't usually have. They can create a sense of concern, fear, or attachment. They can bring an audience back to a time when they were young. And none of these are really executed in The Strain. It looks to me like a couple of things were attempted with the Zach character and none of them were fully paid off. Like, he has this unquestioning love for his dad in the beginning, and it transfers over to his mother who is interned. And in that way, we have like a child's love for their parents, and we have the innocence of continuing to trust and believe in that parent even when they've been transformed into something else. And those are interesting questions and like worth exploring, but we don't really do that. We just have like Zach waffling between these two adults and never like coming on a decision or learning anything. And we also have like this theming of like corrupting the child going on, both by his mother and by like kind words from the Master and Einhorn later in the series. But like his fall from like being appalled and scared and sad about some things to like being totally chill with straight up murdering people because they rejected him or whatever. It's not a good transition. And with Zach's character, we had like this opportunity to hold up a mirror to the Pan Labyrinth Ophelia character, because she is also trusting of these monsters. She also wants to please her dad in the underworld and be reunited with him. She's going on this quest with all these magical sort of scary creatures. But at the end of it, when Ophelia brings her baby brother to the labyrinth and the fawn asks him to shed her brother's blood so that she can be reunited with her dad from the underworld, Ophelia refuses. It's a huge, crucial moment. And we're sort of watching Zach follow a similar pattern here, where he goes with his mother, who's a turned vampire at this point in time. He's like living isolated with all these other vampires. He's encouraged to trust and rely on them. But where Ophelia eventually makes the choice to choose her brother and choose humanity, Zach chooses the Strigoi and the vampires. And then we're supposed to expect like some other things to happen at the end of season 4, and it's just too fast after like such a final transformation. Because it's handled so poorly, even though there's a lot of like dark mirror points of comparison between these two characters, ultimately it unfortunately just kind of crumbles. Several characters and plot points are just left by the wayside or not used to the fullest. Probably one of the things that made me the most angry in this show is the Ancients and the Strigoi army the Ancients have. Like, we could have cut everything related to the Ancients out of the stream and shortened it so much, and it wouldn't have mattered to the plot or the real story that was being told here. That just made me so angry, especially because part of the reason I stopped watching in the first season was the introduction of the Ancients and the Strigoi army that's fighting the other Strigoi. It's like,
that was wild and out of left field and didn't make any sense to me, and like took away from the human versus master drama we had going on.
Was annoying and disheartening for a minute in season 1, and then just like doesn't come back until season 2. So that's incredibly like a frustrating, dangling plot thread. I can't even imagine experiencing that in season 1 and having to wait like forever for season 2 to come out to get anything that has to do with them. You might even have forgot about them by the time they come up again. The costuming for the Ancients looks like a lot of other generic monster work Del Toro has done in the past. There's nothing about them that's special or interesting, and that to me made it feel like an inclusion more of ego and self-indulgence than anything else, since it doesn't help facilitate the story in any way. In fact, we see 3 of 7 Ancients. Why do we even mention there's 7 of them if we're never gonna fucking meet them? And on top of that, we hear about another Ancient who was trapped over in Egypt, and you expect that to come into play because there's a boat coming from Egypt to New York City, and that's not what was on the boat. So that was just another moment that was like, fuck me, and how disrespectful to your audience, and just like these plot threads that mean nothing and require so much belief from the audience and don't add or do anything. It just made me really deeply angry and frustrated with the series. The book, The Lumen, also never pays off, and they keep dragging us back to this stupid-ass book. Like,
okay, I would have been fine with it as a fetch quest one time,
but we keep coming back to Abraham's obsession with the Lumen and how there have to be answers and like a secret way of reading it. And there's these little things that come in, like the real text can only be seen in the sunlight. That makes it feel like maybe the Lumen is important. Or there's this moment at the end of the 4th season where Abraham is like kind of losing his marbles. It's just been way too long without his like life-saving whatever. And he's pulling the pages out of the Lumen and connecting it like conspiracy board style. And he has this moment where he's like,
no, what I thought was this translation is not the translation, and we need to do something else.
And before he gets a chance to articulate what that something else is, he gets attacked. And we never find out what that is. And it never comes back into play in the solution to the Strigoi problem of season 4. So I found that really upsetting. The solution they use to the Strigoi problem is just dissatisfying and disheartening. They keep talking about how there has to be another way and another component, and then they say something about how really the human collaborators are the monsters and we need to deal with that, and the Strigoi problem will solve itself, which I felt was like smart and onto something, and I thought we were going to go someplace with that. And instead of that, we just end up nuking the master. So that was like super dissatisfying. It only highlighted the flaws inherent in the show. Like if we hadn't had all that Lumen nonsense and all that talk about how the human collaborators were the worst part, if we hadn't had all that conversation, then some of this flaw I could like overlook and not find it like dissatisfying. But because you keep rubbing my face in it, it's really hard for me to overlook. Also, I kind of hate Quinn and think he's a terrible character. Now, Quinn is Blade if Blade had a shred of humanity in him and also looked more monstrous and less human. There are several things I hate about Quinn. First of all, the connection he has to his father and how if he kills his father, he'll die doesn't make any sense. The other Strigoi live after we kill the master, so why wouldn't Quinn? Like, that seems like a melodramatic arc there just for angst. It doesn't make any sort of story format sense. And personally, because I've been watching this all like in the span of a couple of months, I felt like the whole
"If I kill him, I die too"
was an overcorrection from Blade's storyline, where he just like chooses humanity even though there are no stakes or reasons for it. Quinn's storyline explains why he chose humanity's side instead of his vampire father's side, and it's compelling and interesting and rich, and I think it would have fixed the Blade problem all on its own. But it's like the writers didn't have confidence in themselves and in the story and in their audience. They felt like they needed to add this extra like reason this was such a big decision for him to make and why it was especially hard for him to go against his father. I just thought it was dumb. Part of what I love about Guillermo del Toro's stories is that he tells such great human stories where everyone is so fully rounded. Even the monsters, they feel like fully fleshed out people with wants and needs. And traditionally, over his filmography, you'll see very like human, fully rounded female characters. And that's part of why The Strain was incredibly disappointing to me, is the women are not fully fledged, full arc humans. I remember watching the show and looking at the female characters and thinking,
there must be zero women in the writing room or directing or with any kind of advisory roles on set.
It bothered me so much both how the men were portrayed in a way that I think is specifically off-putting to women, and how the women were characterized in ways that really flatten one note, that I went and I looked up the credits for both writing and directing to see if there were any women in there. And just so you know, there's 14 credited writers for this show, and only 3 of them are women. Across 46 episodes, there are 11 credits of a female writer. As for directing, there's 2 women out of 21 separate directorial credits, and between the 2 female directors, they're credited with 3 episodes. I want to be clear, I'm not mentioning the lack of women here as a gotcha moment. Men can create excellent female characters, and in fact, Guillermo del Toro usually does. I'm mentioning it because the female characters and some of the depictions of the male characters were so bad in a way that distinctly felt like a lack of female input that I went and I looked it up. And here's the thing, I'm pro diversity casting and diverse voices to give multiple different perspectives both on and off screen. But even if you're not for that, for whatever reason, a movie or show or story should never be so single perspective that it kicks you out of the narrative and has you wondering like,
who the heck wrote this? Because they sure don't know jack shit about these kinds of people, or they wouldn't be portraying them this way.
It feels spectacularly in creating a rounded female character among any of the options that we have available. And overall, I would just say one of the main problems in The Strain is that it's trying to do too many things at once and failing to fully deliver on any of those elements. Even its core premise, humans versus vampires, where I should have easily been able to side with humanity, I found myself, much the same way as I did in Blade 2, thinking,
but why not vampires?
Yes, the show depicts the human collaborators as monstrous, often more monsters than the Strigoi vampires themselves. And you'll get no argument from me that those characters committed atrocities and acts of evil. I'm not rooting for that team necessarily. The problem arises when we look for the team that's trying to save humanity and what they're willing to do to save us. Yes, Team Human is less cruel to humans than Team Strigoi is, but where they're willing to go as far as how they treat Strigoi, people who are infected who will be turned into Strigoi, and even the human collaborators is all pretty dark and not great. So if you're looking at the 2 sides and you're thinking Strigoi's enemies are the humans and they're treating them terribly, and you look at the humans and you're saying, humans' enemy are the Strigoi, and they're treating Strigoi and infected humans terribly. Really what you have to do is look at overall happiness and health. And if you look at the Strigoi side, all the Strigoi seem to be happy and healthy on their little Strigoi team. And on the human side, the humans don't really seem to be treating other humans very well, and they don't seem to be happy or healthy over there. Maybe the master's argument that being Strigoi is better than being human is correct. At least as the show is depicted, it feels like he's making a valid argument. Here's the thing, if that was what the strain intended to do, then it succeeded. It does shake things up and make you ask those questions. But I don't think that was the intention. I think the intention was that we were supposed to be team humanity all the way and try to come to terms with some of the things we had to do to preserve humans and justify it in that the Strigoi were worse. And I agree what the Strigoi were doing to humans was terrible, but the Strigoi did not treat other Strigoi badly. It puts me in this weird catch. So if we move over into the actual story that's being told here, excluding season 4, generally speaking, the show made me feel both frustrated and anxious. I do think the strain takes on a different tone here in 2022 than it did in its initial release in 2014. Post-pandemic world, seeing the original panic the strain caused from a pandemic lens is particularly anxiety inducing. Perhaps things go a little bit worse in the strain, perhaps they go a little bit worse in real life. It's arguable depending on location. Unfortunately, the show is a little too true to life in those particular ways, even if disease of the Strigoi is purely fantastic. Season 2 focuses heavily on an arc to find a disease that kills Strigoi but doesn't kill humans, and it eventually pays off with a disease that does this, and leads us onto an arc to figure out a way to mass disperse the disease. The Strigoi just randomly become immune to the disease for no reason. And it's never really explained or looked into, doesn't make any sense, and is incredibly annoying and makes it feel like that whole journey we went on was for fucking nothing, and we just watched a lot of crap for no reason. I think the reason we had the find a disease that can kill the Strigoi thing is so that we had something for our sciencey people to do that was sciencey, but there's a whole bunch of other experiments they could have done or things they could have brought back that they just didn't build on, like testing the Strigoi to see if they could starve, testing to see if other animals could become Strigoi, attempting to isolate another Strigoi the same way that they eventually isolate the master in a silver lead box. If you isolate one single Strigoi from the collective, do they return to some sense of self and humanity? Or are they just an animal creature? That would have told us so much about the Strigoi and could have led to some interesting dilemmas. If the master is the only one who's granting Strigoi any sense of sentience and separating them that just makes them into feral creatures, that's worth knowing. And if separating them from the master brings back their human memories, their human sense of self, and makes them less dangerous, that's also worth knowing. It makes the plan to cut the master off from them make so much more sense and leads to easier solutions and a whole lot more interesting character things. And I think we dismiss the whole potential for an early treatment for humans who are exposed to Strigoi worms too quickly. The first experiment in Jim happened in suboptimal conditions where they attempted to cut out the one worm they saw and weren't really able to monitor him or follow up to see if there were more worms in him. Knowing that later in the season, Fett is actually able to keep someone from getting infected by killing the one worm that entered them, it seems to imply that they should have tried some more intervention in early stages of Strigoi vampireness. Also, as far as it comes to things that will kill the Strigoi, I don't think we fully explored, for example, putting blood thinners in people's body to make them less susceptible to Strigoi attack, or maybe with enough blood thinner, the worms can't survive in people. So even if you get bit or attacked, you don't turn into a vampire because the vampire worm thing can't live in there. Or even being perpetually sick with some kind of illness that the Strigoi know will kill them. It just seems like there was a lot of interesting sciencey stuff we could have done and we just totally gave up on it. Also, all the different kinds of vampires being introduced was rough. I get that it was there to create a variety of interest in vampires and different foes to keep viewer interest so we weren't always seeing the same thing happen the same way. But number one, it didn't work. I was still bored. And number two, it just annoyed me because I was
where are all these different kinds of vampires coming from? Are there different kinds of worms?
There was no explanation as to the why and the how of that. F has a fight with alcoholism, starting with him being sober for several years in the beginning and then beginning to drink again and being constantly drunk. I just don't understand why this was added into the story. It didn't add anything. There was never any comeuppance for F being drunk or like any reward for F being sober. And like, if him being perpetually drunk has no downside, then I don't know why we care, you know? It just seems like a thing that we focused on a lot for no reason. Also, there's like a tough on Strigoi subplot where like police are going in and forcing all the Strigoi out. Certain sections of New York City like Strigoi free, and this whole subplot was just like not utilized well. There were a lot of interesting things we could have done and a lot of different things it could have been saying, and in the end it was kind of just a distraction from the quest the main characters were going on, and it doesn't end in an interesting or satisfying way. I'm also really confused how F is supposed to be considered like the good guy or heroic in any kind of way in this show. He's portrayed in lights that seem to imply that we're supposed to admire or like him or sympathize with him, and I just didn't feel that way about the character, and I don't understand how anyone could. He's like a womanizer and he is unfaithful, and you know, that's fine in a character, but I was really confused because he wasn't nice or kind or empathetic. He wasn't really smart. He was very arrogant, dismissive. He was constantly making fun of people and belittling them and putting them down. I just kept thinking to myself, like,
why are so many women sleeping with him? He is not the only man left standing.
And there are a couple of characters that could have gotten some action and didn't. Meanwhile, F is sleeping with everything that has a heartbeat. And I don't know why that's happening, because he has no redeeming qualities that I can see. He's not a good dad. He's not good at his job at the CDC. He's not even that good a vampire killer. Feels like a lot of times he manages through dumb luck and sheer ruthlessness. As a character, he makes as much sense on the Strigoi side as he does on the human side. And maybe that's the point of him. Maybe he's supposed to be just like a gross douchebag. I do have a similar issue with Abraham, but it's a little bit to a lesser extent. He is super dismissive of his wife when we catch them in flashbacks, and it feels like he didn't really respect her wishes, wants, or desires, and that he is in love with the idea of love, and he is mourning the concept of his wife more than her as an actual person. It feels like he didn't really know her as a person. But at least when he's being like a bit of a dismissive douchebag to his wife, or talking over her, or ignoring what she wants, it's set in the 1940s, and I can think to myself,
every man in this time period was like that with women, pretty much.
Beyond that, when we see Abraham in modern day, he really does make emotional connections to other characters. He hears where they're coming from. He supports them in their trials. He gives them space to make their own mistakes and gives them chances at redemption. And I just don't feel like F manages any of that. The women are played overwhelmingly as victims and martyrs. They're either too caring and compassionate to survive in this world, and the men are often saving them from their own compassionate nature. Nora is an example of this. I understand that she didn't die in the novels, like something else happened to her, but she does die in season 2 of the TV show. It's incredibly sexist and stereotypical, and she's used as a prop for F in a way that is very unpleasant. The Strigoi in this universe, when they turn loose their reproductive organs, so the concept of like rape or assault between the Strigoi and the humans seems like it would be non-existent. And somehow they still managed to put Dutch in a position to be assaulted by Einhorst. And that really bugged me. You created a monster that is doing terrible things, and then you made it so they couldn't assault people and still found a way around that. Like, that's incredibly gratuitous and over the top and over the line to me. There could have been so many ways to terrorize Dutch that didn't prey on the fact that she was a woman, and that's not what they did. And because they did this to the one character who was bisexual and was at the time about to choose a woman partner over a male partner, it felt particularly punishing, like she had chosen the wrong people to be with and this was her comeuppance. The whole thing just struck me as particularly nasty and like on a subconscious level punishing her for the decisions they'd written her to make. Lastly, Coco was a super interesting introduction in season 2 that is immediately killed off, and I thought that was a huge waste of an opportunity. Like, she is open and vulnerable with Eldridge. She makes a real connection. He really falls in love with her, and I'm even fine that the master turns her when he sees how she's controlling Eldridge and she's in the way of his ability to control him and get him to do what he needs. they should have kept her around as a Strigoi, because that would have been so interesting to see if the Master's like manipulating her as like a puppet against Eldridge, or if she's like fighting the Strigoi, or if she is just cold statue now that she's the Strigoi, and like seeing her cold and statuesque and unfeeling right next to Eldridge and him unable to reach out and get to her is an issue. And it could have also been interesting to see if she was like talking about how she could infect him, or they could run away together, or they could create some kind of plan just to get outside of the Master's caverns to be vampires together. All of that could have been like a really interesting subplot, and could have been a fun way to go with a female character and give them a full arc. And it could have been like a really compelling female villain, which is something else the show is lacking. I won't even get into Always Kelly Disappoints Life. So when we look at like overarching themes and filmography for Del Toro, I kind of look at The Strain as an attempt for story redemption in Blade 2. The vampires that we see in The Strain are very similar to the new kind of vampire that's introduced in Blade 2. So visually, we're getting a lot of similar things going on. The Ancients look like a lesser version of other monsters I've seen, like from Pan's Labyrinth. Quinn's story is Blade's story, except more humanized. And some points of Quinn's story really do work, while others fall short. Del Toro might have writer's credits and a few directorial credits, and to that end, thematically, I can see a couple little elements here and there that scream Del Toro, but the overall effect of the show is just lacking. I would think of The Strain a little bit as the Dark Mirror to Pacific Rim. In Pacific Rim, humanity triumphs through their unity, and in The Strain, humanity collaborates with the evil and falls apart. If you ignore my frustration in seasons 1 through 3, the Strigoi in those seasons are like a perfect metaphor for late-stage capitalism, which is something Del Toro hits on multiple occasions in his work. There's a ton of underground scenes and underground tunnels and whatnot throughout the entirety of The Strain, and this work does shine a light on dark and macabre and horrific elements. And lastly, I would think that The Strain kind of helps set expectations for what we're looking for in Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, specifically because we'll be comparing like this TV show that he has writing credits and some directorial credits with this new horror anthology with all different directors. He might like have a spark of inspiration or a input here and there, but we're just going to see a lot of diversity, I think, in what we're looking at. And if we're looking at the caliber of his movies versus the caliber of his TV show, we should just tone down those expectations a little, be more interested in the themes and story blocks than we are in the visual art and design. Anyways, that's going to be my thoughts on The Strain. Have you guys seen any part of the series? If so, tell me what you think in those comments down below. Thanks for coming with me on this journey. It was a very long one. And as always, keep reading. Bye!